Let me start by talking about some concepts that are utilized in private sector rehabilitation. And let me first start by talking about what the major roles and functions are of rehabilitation professionals in private sector rehabilitation. And there are several. One would be conducting vocational evaluations and vocational assessments, where we would look at what a person's abilities are in terms of the person's background and in terms of the skills, and we'd make a determination as to the vocational skills the individual has. And then we would look at the abilities of the person in terms of academic abilities and intellectual abilities and aptitude abilities. And then we would make recommendations regarding whether the person can return to the past work, whether the person can do other work, and whether the person would be a candidate for some type of vocational retraining. And usually when we do these types of assessments, we rely upon not just what the person tells us, but also objective medical findings and medical information from physicians. We also, in doing this type of evaluation, we would also be involved with using sources such as the Dictionary of Occupational Titles or the ONET to determine job areas that the person would be qualified to function in. So vocational assessment and vocational evaluation is an important component of what we do, and it's based upon not just our interview with the person where we collect background information, but it's also based upon getting information from the physicians who have evaluated the person, and especially looking for physical work restrictions or physical work abilities and vocational testing that has been conducted. We also do various types of case management services, and I'm going to get into some of these concepts in a few minutes. We do job analysis, and we do job modifications. We do job development. On occasion, we're required to provide expert testimony in some sort of court situation, whether it's an administrative courtroom or whether it's a civil courtroom. And we also coordinate our services with physicians and attorneys and employers, and we work with all the players who are working with the individual. In some cases, we will also be involved with doing marketing of services and trying to solicit business, particularly if we are running and operating a private rehabilitation company which may specialize in things such as case management services. There are some concepts that I think are important to understand in worker compensation in particular. One concept is a notion of occupational disability, where an administrative law judge or some other entity would decide how disabled a person is, and that could be based upon how old the person is, the education of the person, where they reside, their geographic location, their prior work, and the physical condition and or mental condition of the individual. So some states in their worker compensation programs rely upon this notion of occupational disability in determining how disabled somebody is. And other jurisdictions will just rely upon an impairment rating. Doctors will evaluate somebody, and there are books that say if you have this loss of function, or if you've had this surgery, or if you have this amputation, this is the percent of disability that you have. And it's based upon just an objective assessment, no matter if the person was a college professor or if the person was a construction laborer. If you have whatever the injury you have, no matter who you are, you get the same impairment rating. And so you have these two different systems of determining disability. This concept of occupational disability, which kind of broadly looks at everybody, and you have this other system of just a straight impairment rating that just says what is your impairment, and that's your disability. And then you have hybrid systems which combine this notion of occupational disability with this notion of just an impairment rating and come up with some sort of way to determine how disabled somebody is. Why are disability ratings important in worker compensation? They're important because they determine how much money somebody gets. And how that works is, let me just talk a little bit about the process of what happens when somebody is injured. When somebody is injured at work, they are considered, while they are in recovery, to be temporarily totally disabled. So it's like you have the flu and you can't work for a week. You are not working and you are temporarily totally disabled. Now, the flu is not a compensable situation, but it's an analogous situation. So a person is not working, the person gets injured, injures his or her back, they're off work for a period of time, then they are in a status of temporarily totally disabled. Now, sometimes people get better, come right back to work after a week or 2 weeks or a few days, and life goes on, everything is fine, and they might have gotten payment for treatment of that injury. If they've missed more than a week or so, they're entitled to lost wages for that time period, and they go back to work and everything is fine. On the other hand, you get people who get injured and they're in this temporarily totally disabled status, but it then appears that that person is not going to be able to go back to work. So the person would then at some point be determined to be as good as he or she is going to get. And when that happens, when they've recovered as much as they're going to recover, they are in the status of being called at maximum medical improvement, or MMI. When they're at MMI, then two things can happen. And it could be that the person and the employer decide what level of disability the person has, or if they're disputing the level of disability the person has, then they go in front of an administrative law judge or some other hearing officer who then looks at all the evidence and looks at all the medical reports and makes a determination as to how disabled that person is. And that's where what I said before comes into play, this concept of occupational disability, or just a straight impairment rating based to determine disability, or a hybrid system. And the hearing officer or the judge says what that level of disability is. And that level of disability is important for the person, because the judge could say that you are permanently totally disabled, which means that you can't go back and do your old job or even other jobs. Or the judge could say you are permanently partially disabled, in which case the person is found to be able to do some jobs. Now, at that point, when they get to MMI, see, before MMI, the person is not working, they're receiving benefits at whatever the specified benefit level would be, which is usually 2/3 of the person's average weekly wage up to a certain maximum. And the actual numbers aren't important, just the concept's important. But at the time the person is determined to be at MMI, maximum medical improvement, and at the time that the judge decides how much disability the person has, there are formulas in which that disability rating is plugged into. The formulas are plugged into the disability rating, and that determines how much money the person is going to be compensated for from that point forward. If the person is permanently totally disabled, then they usually will get an amount of money that would cover their wage loss up to whatever the percentages are, which is somewhere in the range of about 2/3 of the average weekly wage that exists in the state, and that goes on until a normal retirement age, or in some states it could go on through life expectancy. On the other hand, if someone has a permanent but partial disability, they would only get a reduced amount of money, and many people choose to take that reduced amount of money in a lump sum, whereas others would spread that out. So it may only be that the person's going to get $25 a week, or maybe $50 a week, just depending upon the impairment rating the judge or the hearing officer comes up with. So those are important concepts. And if let's say the person gets $25 a week, when you're only permanently partially disabled, you may only get that for a certain number of years. So if you multiply the number of years times $25 a week, that would be whatever this lump sum settlement could be. So people sometimes prefer to take that rather than just getting a small amount of money weekly. So those are some concepts that occur in private sector rehabilitation. Some other things to be aware of that, as I said, in public rehabilitation, we have the criteria for eligibility is having a physical or mental impairment, limiting a person's function, and the presumption of benefit following rehabilitation services in terms of employment. In private sector rehabilitation, people are covered by insurance. Also, in private sector rehabilitation, as I'm saying, I alluded to the fact that we don't just look at what the person's potential is and what they can do in terms of getting back to work. What we also look at would be a hierarchy of return to work. So if you're a rehabilitation professional in the private sector, then the first thing that you would look at when you're working with the person is, number one, can this person go back to the same job with the same employer? If not, can the person do a new or different or modified job with the same employer? If that doesn't work, can the person go and do the same job with a different employer or a different job with a different employer? Then next in line in terms of what would be appropriate would be some sort of short-term training program. In some states only will authorize rehabilitation to pay for no more than the maximum of 52 weeks of retraining. And then finally, self-employment would be an option. That would be a hierarchy that would be looked at in terms of vocational rehabilitation and a return to work. So those are some basic concepts that are important to look at. I've given you a little bit of the history of worker compensation. I think that it's important to go through the various slides, and again, they are self-explanatory in terms of how rehabilitation functions. And if you have questions about these, I think it would be important for you to let me know, and I can certainly attempt to address those. Many of the concepts that I've talked about are in these slides, and you might find that in certain cases there's some degree of repetition when we try to make points in a little different manner. I think that's not all that bad, because then you get the same concepts coming at you in a few different ways. I do want to stress some other final points regarding the first week that I think it's important for you to look at. That first of all, in private sector rehabilitation, in terms of looking at the jobs the person can and can't do, we rely less on the statements the person makes and more on the information that is given to us through physicians. And what we specifically look for would be things such as the person can only lift 20 pounds or can lift 30 pounds, because we can then go back and tie those back to specific jobs in the DOT. In public rehabilitation, as we know, we can rely more on anecdotal information from the individual in terms of what he or she cannot and can do. Also, as I said, private sector rehabilitation is not designed to be adversarial, but because of the nature of determining the degree of disability, there can be differences of opinion from different physicians, and that can lead to a sense of it being adversarial. On the other hand, it's considered to be a no-fault system, whereby the person doesn't have to prove that the employer was negligent. The person can say, I injured my back, and then go for treatment and get compensated. So that part of it is not adversarial for the most part. But what is adversarial is when there are questions about the severity of the injury and whether the person can return to the past work or whether they can do other work. That's where the arguments come in. So as professionals, we have to be prepared for the majority of cases that we get referred to us if we're working in private rehabilitation are going to have some degree of adversarial aspects, where there'll be attorneys on one side and attorneys on the other side, and there'll be the employer, because the employer may have something to say about whether the employee should come back to work or not, and sometimes there can be underlying issues regarding whether the employee was considered a valued employee, and there'll be a lot of things that we might not know about that might be going on in terms of whether the employer is going to be willing to take somebody back or to modify a job for a person. Also, it's important to recognize that in private sector rehabilitation, the vast majority of rehabilitation professionals are individuals who are self-employed, or they work for large private companies. And in working for large private companies, they would do the functions that I said: the case management, the vocational assessment, the job placement, the marketing. They do those types of functions. Whereas in public sector rehabilitation, it's more of a monopoly. The majority of rehabilitation professionals will work either for a rehabilitation state agency, or they work in a rehabilitation facility that works with the state rehabilitation agency. So those are some of the differences. I believe the slides that you have expand on those concepts and have those concepts fairly straightforward for you. Just some other things that you'll see. There are some studies that you'll see in the slides that talk about services that people offer in private sector rehabilitation and where they work. There are some also issues where you'll see that in many cases there are another profession that we work closely with who in some ways overlap with us would be the nursing profession. What nurses do in private sector rehabilitation is they are involved to a great extent with case management from the time of the injury to the time when the person gets to maximum medical improvement, whereby they will be working with the individual to determine with the physician the progress the person is making in terms of medical improvement. And so they may take people to the doctor. They may consult with the doctor who's treating the person, and that's what a medical nurse would do, a medical or a occupational nurse would do. We would do more of the vocational aspects of the person once they've reached maximum medical improvement. So we would be more involved with helping the person go back to work and looking at return to work issues. But as you can see, there can be some overlap in these functions. Then another, in summary, or not quite in summary, but just one other topic to talk about would be some of the ethical issues that can arise in private sector rehabilitation. And of course, we do have to maintain our ethical standards and ethical codes of conduct. I'll touch on just briefly some of the ethical dilemmas that can arise, and we're going to talk more about these at the end of the semester, when I think some of it will perhaps make more sense than right now at the beginning of the semester. One area of ethical concern would be, who is the client? Because the client is referred to us typically by an insurance company, and yet we're asked to help the individual who has the disability. So the question then arises, since the insurance company is paying us, the question arises, who is our client? Is it actually the person with the disability, or is it the person paying our bills, who can be and will be somebody different? Also, there can be ethical situations in terms of the fact that in many cases in private sector rehabilitation, people don't come to us. In public sector rehabilitation, people come to our office, or we go to a rehabilitation program the person is in. Less commonly, we will visit somebody at home. Well, in private sector rehabilitation, we visit people at home, And in many cases, people go into, the professional goes into the person's home, and again, this can cause a degree of conflict, especially if things happen or you see things happen that may not be directly related to what we're supposed to be doing. So that's another area of ethical concern. Billing and being consistent in billing could be, and billing for the hours that we spend can also be raise some ethical issues, so that we avoid double billing in situations where we're making multiple visits to different people. And also we have privacy regulations that we need to adhere to, especially when we deal with confidential client information, consumer information, and when we work with physicians and other healthcare providers and third-party individuals who might do independent evaluations. We have to be careful that we adhere to ethical standards. So at this point, those are the concepts that I wanted to talk with you about on week 1. And as I said, let me know if there are any questions that you might have, and I'll be glad to address those.